Picture this. You're standing barefoot on a moonlit beach in the Caribbean in the spring of 1573. The warm, salt wind carries the smell of gunpowder and burning palm wood. A few feet away, a Spanish soldier lies dying in the wet sand, his white uniform soaked dark red, his rosary clutched in a hand that will never close again. And there, spinning in slow, lazy circles next to his outstretched fingers, catching the silver moonlight, is a single hand-cut coin. A barefoot man with a sun-cracked face and salt-tangled hair steps over the dying soldier. He bends down, picks up the coin, and holds it close to his eye. He bites it. He smiles. That coin, no bigger than a communion wafer and weighing less than an ounce, has just become the most dangerous object in the world. Because this is not just any coin. This is a real duacho, a piece of 8. And in the next 250 years, this single design, minted by the mightiest empire on earth, is going to bleed that empire dry from the inside out. It will fund pirates, finance revolutions, build cities, and become the unofficial currency of every port from Shanghai to Boston to Cape Town. Surviving Spanish treasury records, smuggled merchant ledgers, and forgotten colonial court documents tell a chilling story that no royal historian wanted to write down. An empire did not just lose its grip on the seas. It quietly forged the very weapon that would be used to rob it for 3 centuries straight. How did a single coin transform from a symbol of absolute Spanish power into the favorite currency of every pirate, smuggler, and rebel on the planet? Before we dive into this forgotten story of silver, blood, and quiet revenge, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this one. And please drop a comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we can sit together across oceans and centuries and unpack these forgotten stories, all of us connected by the same curiosity about how the world really got built. Now, to understand why this coin became so dangerous, you first have to understand how impossibly powerful Spain had become by the middle of the 1500s. This was not just a kingdom. This was the first true global empire in human history. Spanish ships ruled the Atlantic. Spanish soldiers crushed the Aztec and Inca civilizations. Spanish governors ran colonies from Manila in the Philippines all the way to Mexico City, to Lima, to Havana. The sun, they said, never set on the Spanish crown. And the engine that powered all of this, the beating heart of the entire empire, was a single mountain. High in the freezing Andes of what is now Bolivia, at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters, there is a cone-shaped peak called Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill. In 1545, a Spanish prospector discovered that this entire mountain was made of silver, not silver deposits scattered through rock, silver. Vein after vein of it, stacked thousands of feet deep, more silver in one place than humanity had ever seen before. Spain immediately built a city at the foot of that mountain called Potosi. Within a few decades, Potosi had exploded into one of the largest cities on Earth, bigger than London, bigger than Paris, bigger than Madrid itself. And from this remote frozen mining town, an unimaginable river of silver began flowing back across the ocean to fill the treasure vaults of the Spanish crown. Every year, fleets of heavy galleons sailed from the Caribbean ports of Havana and Cartagena, their bellies stuffed with thousands of crates of newly minted silver coins, heading straight to the Royal Mint in Seville. And the coin they minted, the standard unit of all this fantastic wealth, was the real duacho, the piece of 8. It was a thick, heavy, hand-cut disc of nearly pure silver, stamped with the royal crest of Spain on one side and the famous Pillars of Hercules on the other. The number 8 referred to its value, 8 reals, the basic unit of Spanish currency. And because every coin was cut by hand from a long silver bar, no 2 pieces of 8 were ever exactly identical. They were rough around the edges, slightly uneven, beautifully imperfect. And that small detail, that tiny manufacturing quirk, would soon become the empire's deadliest vulnerability. By the year 1570, the Spanish believed something that would prove to be fatal. They believed that God himself had given them this silver mountain. They believed their wealth was divinely protected. They believed no other nation on earth could possibly challenge them. They had the biggest fleets, the most experienced sailors, the deadliest infantry, and a stranglehold on every shipping route across the Atlantic. They had completely forgotten how to be afraid. That is exactly the kind of blindness that always invites disaster. Because while the gold and silver flowed into Seville, a quiet and terrible cost was being paid on the other side of the ocean. A cost that history has tried very hard to forget. To stand inside the silver mines of Potosi in the 1570s was to stand inside hell on earth. Imagine being lowered by a thin rope deep into a black narrow shaft, hundreds of feet underground, where the air is so thin and so poisoned with mercury dust that men collapse and never wake up. The Spanish overseers had instituted a forced labor system called the Mita, which required indigenous communities across the Andes to send a steady stream of men into the mines. Officially, it was a labor draft. In reality, it was a death sentence. These were the Quechua and Aymara peoples, descendants of the great Inca civilization. They were marched hundreds of miles from their villages to Potosi, separated from their families, and forced underground for shifts that lasted weeks at a time. They worked by candlelight in spaces so cramped they could not stand up. They breathed in mercury vapor from the silver refining process, a poison that ate away at their lungs and nervous systems. The Spanish would lower them down with a small bag of coca leaves to chew, which dulled their hunger and their pain, and they would not see daylight again for months. When the indigenous population began dying off in catastrophic numbers, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans by the tens of thousands to replace them. These men were chained in the holds of slave ships, shipped across the Atlantic in condition so brutal that 1 in 5 died during the voyage, and then driven into the same poisoned mines. Estimates today suggest that somewhere between 4 million and 8 million people died in the Potosi mines over the course of 3 centuries. 8 million human lives, ground up to produce the silver that became the pieces of 8. Every coin that left that mountain carried the invisible weight of that suffering. Every coin was, in a very real sense, soaked in blood. And the kings of Spain, sitting comfortably on their thrones in Madrid, did not see a single drop of it. To them, the coins were simply numbers in a ledger, pure profit, divine providence. But across the ocean, in the cold gray courts of northern Europe, other kings and queens were watching the Spanish treasure fleet sail past with growing rage and envy. The English, the French, the Dutch, all of them locked out of the New World by the Spanish monopoly. They had no silver mountains of their own. They were running out of money to pay their armies, to build their navies, to compete on the world stage. Their merchants whispered in the taverns of London and Amsterdam. Their queens and kings paced restlessly in their palaces. And in one small island kingdom on the edge of Europe, a young queen began doing the math. She could not declare open war on Spain. Her treasury was nearly empty. Her army was small. Her navy was smaller. But she had something else. She had a quiet, patient ruthlessness. And she had a coastline full of hungry sailors who would do absolutely anything for the right price. Her name was Elizabeth Tudor, and history would come to call her Elizabeth I of England. By the time she took the throne in 1558, England was a small, broke, vulnerable kingdom surrounded by Catholic enemies who wanted her dead. Spain in particular hated her, both because she was Protestant and because her very existence threatened their dominance of the New World. Spanish assassins were sent to her court. Spanish armies massed across the Channel. Spanish ambassadors made open threats. Elizabeth could not fight Spain in the open, so she chose a different strategy, one that was so elegant and so devious that it would change the course of history. She began quietly handing out documents called letters of marque. These were royal licenses that gave private English sea captains permission to attack Spanish ships and steal Spanish cargo, with one critical condition. The crown would take a percentage of every haul. Officially, these men were called privateers. Legally, they were not pirates. They were independent contractors working for the Queen. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. The Queen of England had just turned organized robbery into national policy. And the perfect man for the job was already waiting. His name was Francis Drake. He was not a nobleman. He was not even particularly well born. He was the son of a Protestant preacher from a poor farming community in Devon, England. He had grown up rough, learning to sail on the dirty merchant ships that hauled cargo up and down the English coast. He was short, stocky, with a flame-red beard and pale, fierce eyes. And he had a personal blood grudge against Spain that would shape the rest of his life. Years earlier, as a young sailor, Drake had been part of an English trading expedition that was ambushed by a Spanish fleet in the harbor of San Juan de Ulua in Mexico. The Spanish had agreed to a truce, then violated it, opening fire on the trapped English ships. Most of Drake's crew was slaughtered. He barely escaped with his life. He returned to England broke, traumatized, and burning with a hatred so pure it would never cool. When Queen Elizabeth quietly summoned him to her court and asked if he would be willing to hurt Spain, Drake did not hesitate for a single second. He had everything to prove because he was a commoner in a world ruled by aristocrats. He had everything to gain because he was broke, and he had everything to give because his hatred for Spain was personal, ancient, and absolutely unshakable. He stepped into the role of royal privateer with a hunger that completely shocked the cautious old admirals of the English Navy. They wanted to play defense, guard the coastline, avoid direct confrontation. Drake wanted to sail straight into the Spanish Main and take everything that was not nailed down. The veteran commanders saw him as a reckless commoner playing a dangerous game. They were not wrong, but they had completely misunderstood the era they were now living in. The old rules of naval warfare were already dying, and Francis Drake was about to write the new ones in Spanish blood. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in the Spanish court could have ever predicted. Because the secret weapon that would destroy Spanish dominance was not Francis Drake's ships. It was not English cannons. It was not even the brilliant tactics of a new generation of sea captains. The secret weapon was the coin itself. Think about this carefully. The Spanish were minting millions of pieces of 8 every single year, stamping them out of the silver from Potosi and shipping them across the globe. And because every coin was hand-cut, every coin was slightly different. There were no serial numbers. There were no royal registries tracking individual coins. There was no way for any Spanish official, anywhere in the world, to look at a piece of 8 and prove where it came from or who it had originally belonged to. This was a catastrophic security failure that Spain did not even realize they had. They had created the perfect anonymous currency, a coin that was universally trusted, universally accepted, and completely untraceable. And the moment that coin left the deck of a Spanish galleon and entered the hands of someone else, anyone else, it was suddenly worth exactly the same amount. Every pirate, every smuggler, every quiet merchant who handled stolen silver could spend it openly in any port on earth. They could walk into a tavern in Amsterdam, slap down a handful of pieces of 8 and buy a feast for their entire crew. They could buy ships, weapons, women, food, anything they wanted, and nobody could ever prove the coins had been stolen. Nobody could trace them. Nobody could stop them. Spain had created the perfect currency for its own robbers. It was as if a modern bank had decided to print billions of dollars in untraceable cash, then load them onto unguarded trucks and drive them down a road full of armed bandits. And then, when the bandits inevitably attacked, the bank refused to redesign the bills or change the route. They just kept printing more cash and sending more trucks. That is exactly what Spain did, decade after decade, for the next 200 years. But Drake did not yet know just how perfectly the system would work in his favor. In 1572, he set sail from Plymouth, England, with 2 small ships and a handful of men. He was heading for the Spanish Main with one single objective. He was going to hit the empire where it would hurt the most, and he was going to find the one place where all that silver had to come together before being loaded onto the treasure fleets. That place was a small fortified port on the Caribbean coast of Panama called Nombre de Dios, the name of God, and in the spring of 1573, Francis Drake was about to give it a very different name. The Caribbean in March of 1573 was a furnace. The sun beat down on the palm trees and the green jungle so hard that the heat shimmered off the white sand beaches. Mosquitoes hung in clouds over the swamps. Tropical fevers killed European sailors faster than any Spanish musket ever could. This was not a place where outsiders survived for long. Francis Drake had been hiding in the coves and inlets along the Panama coast for weeks, watching the Spanish patrols, gathering intelligence, and making a deeply unusual alliance, because he had realized something the Spanish had completely overlooked. The mountains and jungles of Panama were full of escaped slaves, Africans who had broken free from Spanish plantations and built their own free communities deep in the wilderness. The Spanish called them cimarrones, the wild ones. They knew every trail, every hidden river crossing, every weakness in the Spanish supply chain. Among them was a man named Diego. History has almost entirely forgotten Diego. The Spanish records mention him only in passing. The English records describe him briefly as a guide. But without this single African freedman, Francis Drake would have failed. The entire history of piracy might have unfolded differently, and the long, slow bleeding of the Spanish Empire might never have begun. Diego had escaped from a Spanish plantation years earlier. He had built a life in the free communities of the Panama jungle. He spoke Spanish, Portuguese, several indigenous languages, and now broken English. And he knew something that Francis Drake desperately needed to know. He knew the exact route of the silver mule train. Here is how the Spanish silver actually moved. The galleons could not sail directly from Potosi because Potosi was inland, high in the mountains of South America. So the silver was first carried by llama caravan down to the Pacific coast, loaded onto smaller Spanish ships, and sailed north to the Pacific coast of Panama. There, it was unloaded and packed onto the backs of hundreds of mules. The mules then walked across the narrow neck of Panama, through the jungle, to the Caribbean port of Nombre de Dios on the other side. From there, the silver was finally loaded onto the great treasure galleons that sailed back to Spain. That jungle crossing was the empire's single greatest vulnerability. For 72 hours, every year, several times a year, the entire wealth of the Spanish New World was strung out along a muddy jungle trail, guarded by a small contingent of exhausted Spanish soldiers. And Diego knew exactly when and where it would happen. On a humid, moonless night in late March, Diego led Francis Drake and a small force of English sailors and African cimarrones through miles of dense Panama jungle. They moved silently, their boots wrapped in cloth, their faces blackened with charcoal. They could hear howler monkeys screaming in the canopy above. They could feel leeches attaching to their legs as they crossed black streams. They could smell their own sweat mixing with the sharp green smell of crushed leaves. And then just before dawn they heard it, the slow, steady sound of hooves, the creak of leather saddles, the low murmur of tired Spanish soldiers complaining about the heat. And then, around a bend in the trail, the silver train came into view. 190 mules, each mule loaded with 300 pounds of silver bars and freshly minted pieces of 8. Roughly 30 tons of silver in total, walking slowly through the jungle, guarded by perhaps 40 Spanish soldiers in the dark, in unfamiliar terrain, half asleep on their feet. The trap snapped shut. The ambush was over in less than 10 minutes. The Spanish soldiers, exhausted from the march, were caught completely off guard. Some fled into the jungle. A few stood and fought and were cut down. Drake himself took a musket ball to the leg but kept fighting. The cimarrones moved through the chaos with terrifying efficiency, men who had personal reasons to want every single Spanish guard dead. And when the smoke cleared, Francis Drake was standing in the middle of a Panama jungle trail, surrounded by 190 mules, looking at more silver than he had ever seen in his entire life. There was so much silver that they could not possibly carry it all back to the ships. They buried tons of it in the soft jungle earth, intending to return for it later. They loaded what they could onto their own backs and onto the backs of the mules they had captured, and they slipped back through the jungle to where their ships waited in a hidden cove. When Drake finally sailed back to Plymouth, England, the cargo holds of his ships were stuffed with so much stolen Spanish silver that Queen Elizabeth's share alone paid off the entire English national debt and left a surplus equal to the crown's yearly income. Elizabeth had quietly bet on a commoner with a grudge, and she had just won a fortune so large it would change the future of her kingdom. She knighted Francis Drake. She publicly pretended to be shocked by his actions. Privately, she funded his next expedition immediately. The myth of untouchable Spanish silver had just been shattered, and every ambitious sailor in northern Europe heard the news and began sharpening their cutlasses. The Spanish response to the Nombre de Dios disaster was so predictable and so catastrophic that it almost feels scripted. They did not pause to reconsider their strategy. They did not reroute their silver shipments. They did not change their coin design to make stolen pieces of 8 identifiable. They did not negotiate with England. Instead, they doubled down on pure imperial arrogance. If their ships had been robbed, they would build bigger ships. If their fleets had been attacked, they would send larger fleets with more soldiers. If pirates were targeting their silver, they would simply mint more silver and ship it faster. They believed with absolute religious certainty that sheer overwhelming volume would protect them. They believed that no enemy could possibly threaten an empire so vast, so wealthy, so divinely blessed. It was the same fatal blindness that destroys every dominant power in history. They had been winning for so long that they could no longer imagine losing. And so the Spanish treasure fleets grew larger. The galleons grew heavier. The armed escorts grew more numerous, but every single one of those ships still carried the same hand-cut, anonymous, untraceable pieces of 8. Every single ship was still a floating jackpot, and every increase in the size of the shipments only made the target richer. Across the Caribbean, the pirate population exploded. Sailors heard the stories of Francis Drake's fortune and quit their jobs on merchant ships to chase glory. Discharged soldiers from European wars drifted to the New World looking for work. Escaped slaves and indentured servants and runaway convicts all converged on the wild, ungoverned islands of the Caribbean. By the middle of the 1600s, the Caribbean had become the most lawless and dangerous body of water on the planet. Names that would become legends began appearing in colonial court documents. Henry Morgan, a Welsh privateer who would sack the city of Panama itself in 1671, walking out with so much silver that his crew had to leave some of it behind. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, who tied burning fuses into his beard to terrify his victims. Calico Jack Rackham, who flew the famous skull and crossbones flag, and sailed with 2 of the most feared female pirates in history, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, who captured over 400 ships in his short career. Every one of them, every single pirate who ever became famous, was hunting the same prize. The pieces of 8, the blood silver of Potosi, reborn as the perfect plunder, the perfect currency, the perfect weapon. And the islands of the Caribbean transformed themselves to serve this new economy. Tortuga, a small island off the coast of Hispaniola, became the unofficial capital of pirate civilization. Then later, Port Royal in Jamaica took its place, growing so wealthy and so wicked that it earned the nickname the richest and wickedest city on earth. The streets of Port Royal in the 1670s were paved with stolen Spanish silver. Taverns served drinks for prices that ordinary sailors back in London could not even imagine. Brothels and gambling halls operated openly, and every single transaction was conducted in pieces of 8. The hunting ground had become a feeding frenzy. The Spanish Empire was being slowly devoured, coin by coin, fleet by fleet, and Spain still refused to understand what was actually happening. Because here is the deeper truth that no Spanish accountant ever wrote down. The pirates were not the real threat. The pirates were just the symptom. The real threat was what happened to the stolen coins after the pirates spent them. Picture a single piece of 8 stolen in the year 1680. A pirate spends it in a Port Royal tavern. The tavern owner pays it to a merchant for a shipment of rum. The merchant uses it to buy sugar from a plantation owner. The plantation owner sends it to London to pay for new equipment. A London banker exchanges it for English currency. An English ship captain carries it to the American colonies and uses it to buy timber. A Boston shipbuilder uses it to pay his workers. And one of those workers, a humble carpenter, uses it to buy bread for his children. In less than 2 years, that one stolen coin has changed hands 20 times. It has crossed the Atlantic twice. It has passed through the pockets of pirates, merchants, planters, bankers, shipbuilders, and carpenters. And nobody, at any point along that chain, has any way of knowing or caring that the coin was originally stolen from a Spanish mule train in Panama. This was happening with millions and millions of coins, every single year, for 200 years. The piece of 8 was so trusted, so universally accepted, and so completely anonymous that it slowly became the default currency of the entire world. In the American colonies, ordinary farmers and shopkeepers used Spanish silver dollars in their daily transactions because the British government refused to mint enough English coins for the colonies. The famous American tradition of cutting coins into pieces, into halves and quarters and eighths, came directly from the piece of 8. The phrase 2 bits, meaning 25 cents, comes from this practice, 2 of the 8 pieces of a Spanish dollar. In China, the piece of 8 became the standard currency for international trade for over 2 centuries. Chinese merchants in Canton and Shanghai would accept Spanish silver dollars and stamp them with their own marks of authentication, marks that Chinese collectors still call chop marks today. The Spanish coin was so common in China that some scholars believe more than half of all the silver mined in Potosi eventually ended up in Chinese hands. In India, in Africa, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Philippines, anywhere ships could sail, the piece of 8 became the trusted universal currency. Local rulers minted their own coins, but commoners and merchants preferred Spanish silver because it held its value and was accepted everywhere. And in the middle of all this, Spain was slowly going broke. Because here is the final brutal irony. The more silver Spain mined, the more coins they minted, the more wealth flowed through their treasury, the poorer the empire actually became. The royal court spent the silver as fast as it arrived, fighting endless religious wars in Europe, building lavish palaces, paying armies of soldiers, importing luxury goods. By the 1600s, Spanish silver was flowing into Madrid and immediately flowing back out again to pay foreign creditors. The empire was drowning in silver and dying of poverty at the exact same time. Meanwhile, Diego, the freed African guide who had made Francis Drake's first heist possible, the man who had quietly helped launch the entire pirate age, faded into the silence of history. The English records mention him for a few months and then forget him. He likely died in the Caribbean, possibly on one of Drake's later voyages, possibly back in the free communities of Panama. No portrait of him exists. No grave marks his resting place. No statue commemorates his contribution. But he is everywhere. His invisible hand is on every piece of 8 that ever changed hands across 3 centuries. His unrecorded courage helped seed the global economy that would eventually replace the Spanish Empire entirely. He is one of the most consequential forgotten people in human history. And he is not alone. The stolen coins built fortunes for ordinary people across continents. African slaves who escaped to Caribbean islands used stolen silver to buy their freedom. Colonial American farmers paid their debts with Spanish dollars and slowly built independence from British control. Chinese merchants used the same coins to build trading networks that survived for centuries. Common people, ordinary people, voting against empire with their pockets, one transaction at a time, in a quiet revolution that no king ever ordered and no general ever planned. By the year 1700, Spain was bankrupt. The country that had once seemed to own half the world was crippled by debt, exhausted by failed wars, and watching helplessly as its colonies grew restless and its rivals grew stronger. The silver still flowed from Potosi, but the empire it had built was crumbling. The treasure fleet sailed for another century, smaller and weaker each year. The piece of 8 remained the dominant world currency until well into the 1800s. The new United States of America even based its dollar on the Spanish silver dollar, and the dollar sign itself is widely believed to have evolved from the Pillars of Hercules design stamped onto every piece of 8. The coin had outlived the empire that made it. If you walk along the wet sand of any Caribbean beach today, you will not find pieces of 8 scattered in the surf. The sea has long since swallowed them, and the few that survive sit in museums and private collections, polished and quiet behind glass. But the lesson those coins carry, the deep brutal truth about how empires actually die, that lesson is still very much alive in the world around you right now. You see it happening every single day. We can call it the Potosi paradox. It is the strange, terrible disease that strikes every dominant power that becomes too rich, too confident, and too dependent on a single source of wealth. It is the gradual realization, always too late, that the thing that made you rich is the same thing that is quietly bleeding you dry, that your greatest strength has somehow become your greatest vulnerability. Think about it carefully. Spain mined more silver than any kingdom in human history. They thought it would make them invincible forever, but the silver did not stay in Spain. It flowed outward into the global economy and slowly built the wealth of every nation that would eventually replace Spanish dominance. Now consider the empires of our own time. They are not built on silver. They are built on data, on attention, on technology, on networks. But the same fatal pattern keeps repeating itself, century after century, in form after form. Consider the social media giants who spent 2 decades convincing the world to pour every private thought and every personal photo onto their platforms. They believed they had built impenetrable digital empires. And then they watched, helplessly, as their own platforms were used to organize protests against them, to expose their internal corruption, to fuel competitors who used their own data against them. Consider the oil empires of the 20th century, who grew so wealthy that they reshaped entire nations. The petrodollar wealth they accumulated funded universities, research labs, and engineers, who in turn began building the renewable energy technologies that may eventually make oil itself obsolete. The oil empires are literally financing their own replacement. Consider the manufacturing superpowers who outsource production to cheaper countries to maximize quarterly profits. For a generation, they grew unimaginably wealthy, and then they watched in horror as those cheaper countries used the manufacturing knowledge they had been given to build domestic industries that now compete with them directly on the global stage. In every single case, the empire creates the very tool that will eventually be used to dismantle it. The silver mountain becomes the silver coin. The silver coin becomes the global currency. The global currency becomes the engine of every rival civilization. The empire collapses. The currency outlives the empire. This is not bad luck. This is not historical accident. This is the basic underlying physics of how power actually flows through the world. Tools cannot be perfectly controlled by those who create them. Wealth cannot be permanently hoarded by those who acquire it. Currencies cannot be kept loyal to the kingdoms that mint them. The moment a tool is good enough to be useful, it is also good enough to be stolen, copied, and turned around against its original owner. The pieces of 8 teach us a brutal and beautiful lesson. The tools of oppression have a way of slipping out of the hands of the oppressor and finding their way into the pockets of ordinary people. Empires do not usually die by the sword. They die by the slow leak of their own currency, their own technology, their own knowledge, their own power, into hands they never expected to reach. So the next time you look at the dominant powers of our world, the giant corporations and the wealthy nations and the unshakable institutions, remember the silver beaches of the Caribbean in 1573. Remember Diego, the forgotten African guide whose name barely survived. Remember the 8 million people who died in the mines of Potosi to produce the coin. Remember the pirates who stole it, the merchants who spread it, and the carpenters and farmers and shopkeepers who used it to slowly, quietly, peacefully build a new world. Every empire is invincible, right up until the exact second it isn't. And the weapon that brings it down is almost always something the empire itself created. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the strange, forgotten story of the Piece of Eight. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments. What modern empire or giant corporation do you think is currently suffering from the Potosi paradox, slowly building the very tool that will one day replace them? Let me know your thoughts below, and I will see you in the next story.